We've been talking about this Department of War.
Gold is a symbol of wealth and status that's lasted for centuries. Associated with all things luxurious in general, it's yielded mixed returns for investors during high inflationary periods.
Gold is at record high prices, and silver prices are at 13-year highs. And they aren't rising because of US inflation. They're rising because the world no longer trusts America. Precious metals are far more than commodities. They're barometers of trust. And right now, those barometers are flashing red for the United States. We're seeing job creation numbers consistently weaker than expected. Unemployment in the US is ticking upwards. The Federal Reserve, once a symbol of control, is now boxed in, unable to hike interest rates without breaking growth, unable to hold without markets collapsing, and being forced towards rate cuts that scream fragility rather than strength. And then in the political arena, you have Donald Trump floating the idea of renaming the Department of Defense into the Department of War. At first glance, it sounds like a joke. But in geopolitics, word matters. Symbols matter. And this one reveals something deeper. A psychology, not of confidence, but of insecurity. Strong empires don't shout their strength. Weak ones rename themselves to hide their insecurity. But the story doesn't end in Washington. It's global. India refused to bend the knee to American pressure on Russian oil. China just paraded its military power for the world to see. The SCO expands. Japan receives further concessions long after the trade deal was signed, because Washington cannot afford to upset its allies when the Quad is already under stress. Taken together, these threads weave a picture of a superpower that is no longer dictating the rules, but negotiating to barely hold the line. The United States looks less like the unchallenged Rome of old and more like an empire slowly adapting to multipolar reality, or at least should be adapting to the multipolar reality. And that, more than anything else, explains why gold and now even silver are shining bright. Let's dive in deeper. Watch till the end. I will start with economics and I'll end with the psychology of this whole thing. Beginning with the economy, because in today's world, economics is power. Friday's release of the US payrolls data tells the story. Month after month, job creation is coming in lower than expected in the United States. Meanwhile, unemployment, while still historically low, has started to begin to creep up. It's not a crisis yet, but it's enough to shake confidence. Earlier last month, President Trump fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which publishes this report. He wasn't happy with the numbers that the commission was putting out. The lady's crime was to revise down the number of jobs being created in earlier months. His allegation was she was politically motivated and manipulating the numbers. Now he's going to put in place his own person for the job. This isn't statistics, it's politics though. And it's shaking the confidence in United States institutions. Economists and past BLS officials have dismissed his allegations as being baseless. They've explained that revisions are routine and they stem from the way the agency receives the data over time and is nothing to do with political bias. As a foreign salesperson in Lehman Brothers in my earlier life, I can 100% agree with what they're saying. We saw many numbers come out retroactively, actually saying that the numbers that were given out earlier were higher or lower, either way. Now, for decades, United States labor markets have been the envy of the world. They're flexible, they're resilient, and they're innovative. But now, investors see the cracks. Companies are cautious. Consumers are being stretched. And the broader US economy looks fragile, with the growth slowing and the debt piling up. The United States government debt is now over $37 trillion, according to the Treasury's own calculations. It stands around 126% of the country's GDP. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be the guardian of stability. But what do we see instead? A central bank that's trapped. Inflation hasn't disappeared, but growth is too weak to justify much higher rates. And that leaves only one path: cutting. And when the Fed cuts into weakness, that's not a policy, that's panic. And to make matters worse, Donald Trump has been harassing Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman. Donald Trump's relationship with the Federal Reserve has never been about quiet respect for institutional independence. It has been about pressure, out in the open, out in public, and relentless. When Jerome Powell was appointed as Fed chair in 2018 by Trump's team, Trump expected loyalty. Instead, Powell delivered interest rate hikes in the face of inflationary risks at the time. And what followed was a barrage, unlike anything modern Fed leaders had seen. Trump called him clueless. He suggested that he was worse than China in harming the US economy. This time round, Trump has labeled him Jerome Too Late Powell. He's also called him a stubborn moron. He's demanded significant immediate interest rate cuts. And he's added that if Powell doesn't comply, the Fed boards should assume control and do what everyone knows has to be done. And he's been floating the idea that he might even fire Powell outright, something that no president has seriously threatened in living memory. For the markets, though, what does this signal? It's a dramatic sign that a central bank that prided itself on apolitical technocracy was being dragged onto the political stage. But Powell isn't the only one in crosshairs. Now, Trump has fired Lisa Cook, the first black woman ever appointed to the Fed's Board of Governors. He called her out for alleged mortgage fraud, calling it deceitful and potentially a criminal conduct. Cook in return has sued Trump's administration, and she's argued that the president lacked any authority to remove her. And her supporters say it's because she didn't vote for the rate cuts when Trump wants them. Now, the result is a central bank caught between its statutory mandate and a political storm, one where every decision is second-guessed as partisan maneuvering. And this matters because the dollar itself is built on perception. Every treasury bond bought by a foreign government, every oil deal priced in dollars, every international loan that's denominated in the greenback, all of this rests on the belief that America is stable, powerful, and in control. And there lies the deeper issue. Once the Fed is no longer perceived to be independent, the dollar itself begins to lose credibility. Investors around the world aren't just reading the jobs data or rate announcements. They're reading the politics behind them. And when they see that the White House publicly harassing the Fed chair, undermining governors, and signaling that monetary policy is a campaign tool, they understand that the United States institutions are weakening from within the country. And that perception alone pushes capital into alternatives. And once again, into that timeless refuge of gold or silver. So when precious metals rise, it's not just about inflation hedging. It's a silent referendum on trust. Trust in the United States economy, in the Fed, in the dollar. And increasingly, that trust is eroding. Now let's talk about symbolism. Because empires don't just project power through armies and banks. They project it through psychology. President Donald Trump just signed an executive order that authorizes the Secretary of Defense, the Department of Defense, and subordinate officials to use secondary titles such as Secretary of War, Department of War, and Deputy Secretary of War, for example, in their official correspondence, in their public communications, in ceremonial contexts, and other non-statutory documents within the executive branch. The Pentagon has been referred to as the Department of Defense since the 1940s. Any official name change would actually require an act of Congress. But using secondary titles gets around that issue. And as you know by now, Donald Trump is all about quick fixes.
Equipment, money. So, we use super glue instead. Go ahead, put it on there.
The president believes that the new name projects strength and resolve. And the order adds that the United States military is the strongest and most lethal fighting force in the world and should have a name that reflects its unmatched power and readiness.
We have the strongest military in the world. We have the greatest equipment in the world. We have the greatest manufacturers of equipment by far. There's nobody to even compete. And you see that with this and so many other things.
The name changes come after China hosted its military parade on September the 3rd in Beijing. The event was attended by Russia's Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. China unveiled some of its new military technology, including advanced tanks, drones, anti-drone lasers, stealth fighter jets, and autonomous naval vessels, among other systems. All of which analysts say showed that China is now more focused on the multi-domain, the joint operations, in a similar fashion to the United States, and that threatens the US. Now, Donald Trump's idea of renaming the Department of Defense into the Department of War may sound like theater, but it reflects something deeper. Strong powers don't need to advertise their strength. They don't need to shout or rename or posture. Their very existence radiates confidence. Weak powers, on the other hand, compensate. They talk louder. They lean on symbolic gestures. They try to show strength because they fear it's slipping. Think of Rome in its later centuries. As its borders shrank, as its enemies grew bolder, its rhetoric grew more dramatic. War was more on its lips than peace. And yet that rhetoric couldn't hide the fact that Rome was reacting to the world, not shaping it. That's the psychology of decline. And that's what Trump's proposal reveals. Not confidence, but insecurity. A defensive empire that feels the need to rename itself just to protect its toughness. Markets pick up on the psychology. Investors don't just read spreadsheets. They read the mood, the tone, the posture. And right now, America's posture looks defensive. Check out the whole vlog I just did on this renaming and the US reaction to China's display of its military power. I will put a link in the description below as well. Across the world, Washington's ability to dictate terms is eroding, and the evidence is piling up. Take India. When Trump rolled out his sweeping 50% tariff against the Indians, US officials assumed that New Delhi would blink. After all, India needed access to United States markets, and the pressure was immense. But instead of folding, India has pushed back. It still is importing Russian crude oil, at least for now. It continues to refine it in massive volumes and is still selling that fuel back into global markets, much of which ends up in the West, especially in Europe. Rather than weaken, India's doubled down. It's starting to diversify its trade routes. It's leaning more heavily into SCO and BRICS frameworks. It went and visited China. The tariffs hardened its resolve. For Washington, it's been a sobering lesson. Even a Quad partner, bolstered by the US to act as the counterweight to China, now acts on its own terms. And then there's Japan. After hitting India with the tariffs, the White House knew it couldn't afford another rupture inside the Quad. So Tokyo has just been quietly handed a gift. US officials granted Japanese automakers an additional 15% benefit, a reduction in tariffs, which for the Japanese had said for a while they were due to get as part of their trade deal. But the United States side had stayed quiet, and it looked as if they were not going to be on the cards until now. Another interesting thing to note, when Trump peevishly posted on Wednesday in response to seeing the pictures of the Chinese military parade, the big question to be answered is whether or not President Xi of China will mention the massive support and blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it to secure its freedom from a very unfriendly invader. He wrote unfriendly invader, and he did not name the Japanese. As we know, Trump is not afraid to take names. So why did Trump refuse to name Japan as the invader? This wasn't economics, it was politics. Washington feared that squeezing India and antagonizing Japan at the same time would fracture the alliance architecture in Asia. So it conceded, reinforcing a perception that the United States no longer dictates, but bargains. Meanwhile, China chose this moment to stage its largest military parade in years. Those hypersonic missiles, advanced naval formations, air power displays. It wasn't just for domestic pride. It was broadcast to the world, a deliberate contrast to US weakness. For Beijing, the message was simple. China is ascendant, confident, and not afraid to show it. For US policymakers, the optics were humiliating. Watching rival project strength while Washington scrambling to hold its partners in line due to those tariffs and giving out concessions now. And all of this plays out under that shadow of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Once a modest forum, the SCO now is an expanding bloc along with BRICS, pulling together major Eurasian powers under a vision that explicitly sidesteps Washington. With India engaging, Russia entrenched, and China leading, the SCO is increasingly seen as a counterweight to US-led institutions. Putting these pieces together, and the pattern is clear. The US is no longer shaping outcomes from a position of strength. It's reacting. Tariffs which were meant to assert dominance backfired with India. Concessions meant to preserve alliances to placate Japan. Military optics favored China, and the SCO continues to expand that multipolar order. The psychology here is simple. Beijing's projecting confidence and Washington's projecting anxiety. These three examples, India, China, and Japan, show the same pattern. US pressure no longer guarantees compliance. Instead, it leads to resistance or having to give concessions or further humiliating optics, like, for example, we've seen with China. This isn't strength, it's insecurity, and Washington is having to blink again and again, what we call Trump taco. This shows the multipolar world in action, not a world where one country replaces the United States, but one where the US is just on one pole among several. And in that world, the dollar's losing its monopoly, the Fed loses its aura of omnipotence, and precious metals gain. Because when investors see uncertainty in global order, they look for the oldest form of certainty, gold and silver. History tells us great powers rarely collapse overnight. They erode gradually through 1,000 small cuts or humiliations, through 100 small concessions, through symbols that once would have been unthinkable, but now feel normal. Payrolls missing targets, rate cuts into weakness, Trump's Department of War, India refusing pressure, China displaying strength, Japan extracting concessions. Individually, all of these are just small stories, each one being a piece of the puzzle. But together they reveal a picture of a United States struggling to maintain the psychology of strength, while the world increasingly perceives weakness. The age of that unipolar dominance is definitely over. Multipolarity is here, and here's the truth. Decline is as much psychological as it is material. Once allies sense weakness, they act differently. Once rivals sense insecurity, they become bolder. And once markets sense fragility, they will reprice assets. That's why precious metals are rising. Because they're not just commodities. They're a mirror of the empire. And right now, that mirror reflects a United States more insecure than at any point in decades. When gold shines, it's not a bet on metal. It's a bet against an empire. And today, that empire is America. Thank you for watching me today. Do share with me your thoughts and comments. I'm Najma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Have a great day.